Well, hello there. This session we're going to be talking about interventions. Up to this point we've been primarily talking about the plan change process itself. Now we're going to talk about what do we do once we have taken the time to enter and contract with the organization. We have gathered some preliminary data, followed up by a much more thorough diagnosis in which we've collected even more data, and we've made some decisions regarding what it is that we need to do. And that's where interventions come in. One of the things that I think your book points out in the reading is that it's oftentimes our tendency to want to rush right in and immediately engage in interventions. After all, this is why many of us wanted to become organizational development consultants, because we wanted to go in and make change. But you can't underestimate the importance of the steps that we've talked about before you really get to this level. You'll see as I walk through a number of principles here how much they are truly contingent upon having done those first steps and in fact actually having done them well. But eventually, once you've done all those things, it's now time to start planning about how we're actually going to make changes, and that's what we refer to as the interventions. In this mini lecture, I'm going to combine chapters 9 and 10 in the sense that I'm going to begin by talking about some general principles about interventions, and then I'm going to talk about interventions at the individual level, which is more the subject matter of chapter 10. Also, let me say that I'm also going to kind of stray quite a bit from your book in the sense that I actually want to supplement your reading rather than just simply go over it. And so I will be sort of introducing some material perhaps that you did not cover in your reading, so as to help maybe nail down some principles, maybe to give you a model in which you can think about a lot of the stuff that you've been reading in a little bit more concise way. But before we do that, let's actually begin with something that you in fact did cover in your reading, and that is to define what we mean by interventions. What are they? Well, we can think of them as a set of structured activities. By structured, we mean that there is some logic to them, there is some sequencing, there's some order to them, in which we're looking at organizational units. Remember that for the most part, an intervention is aimed at the group level, even though we do individual interventions. Usually those are done in service to some larger entity. Generally, we're interested in a task or sequence of tasks with the goals of, and here's sort of the end result, organizational improvement or individual development in that case. I think another thing that's pointed out in your book, which I think is a very good principle, is that despite some standard practices, no two interventions are alike. And that's because no two organizational development consultants are actually going to be alike in how they do some things. So let me give you a model in which I think will help you to think about the different things that you need to pay attention to when you're engaging in an intervention. And that is that there's really sort of 5 things that I'm going to talk about here. One has to do with motivating change. How do you get the organization and or individuals within the organization to be motivated to want to take the change? Creating vision for the change is a very important component of this. The third one, developing political support. As we know, organizations are not just rational entities, they are political, which means that oftentimes people do things that aren't exactly rational, aren't exactly logically developed out, because there are other agendas that are operating there. And then managing the actual transition itself. And then finally, how do you sustain the momentum in the context of the change? Many changes begin with a blast and they tend to fizzle out after only a short while. So how do you sustain that momentum? So once again, these are the 5 things that I think are very important when we approach making interventions. I'm going to drill down at least on 4 of these. Okay, so let's move along. Talking about motivating change. One of the things that we have to do is creating readiness for change within the organization that we're going to work with. One of the ways in which you might do that is simply sensitizing the organization to pressures for change. This is why transparency is very important in an organization. People need to be aware of whatever metrics that the leadership is looking at that let them know that there's a need for change. So if the company is having some financial issues, it helps if you could share that information. If there are pressures in the external market that are changing, those of you who are familiar with the concept of organizational learning, right, this is why that becomes important. Every individual in the organization, in as much as they can be brought up to speed on changes in the industry, changes in the market, right, these are the kind of things that are going to help create some sensitization for the fact that the organization may in fact need to change. Identifying gaps between actual and desired states. Sometimes this is called a gap analysis. Being able to talk about where it is that we hope to go. This is part of that vision component that was mentioned in the last slide. But identifying the difference between where you are now and where it is that you're getting ready to go. Sometimes people seeing how large a gap that is can in fact create a readiness for change. And then thirdly, conveying credible positive expectations for change. Letting people know what are the real benefits, and make sure they're credible. Right? We don't want to sell people, we don't want to oversell it in this case, but truly being able to put your finger on what are some reasonable positive expectations that are likely to happen if the change comes along. And hopefully it's stuff that they would consider credible. Right? Just doing things to line the pockets of senior management isn't going to excite the people in the front lines. And so being able to put your finger on that, I think, becomes important. Obviously, there has to be some of those positive expectations for the front line as well. And so that should let you know that if your change project is only going to benefit a certain segment of people, right, you're potentially going to have some problems unless you can simply show how that benefit is spread around. Okay? Of course, in any situation, you're going to encounter resistance to change. So let's talk about some strategies for overcoming resistance to change. First of all, before I go down this road, let me make a very important point. That is that sometimes we're very too quick to try to kill resistance to change. I personally think that sometimes resistance to change is something that we ought to pay attention to. In many cases, resistance to change, there's a point there. I think we tend to treat it as though it's nothing more than irrational phobias on the part of a few, but in fact someone actually may in fact have some very important information that we want to do. So rather than just rushing to kill it, we may in fact want to try to capture it and better understand it, and maybe even build it in. Even if the change that we're making is inevitable, we can pay attention to that resistance and actually leverage that resistance in a way that's going to ensure that the change is going to be effective. So once again, want to make the point that far from just wanting to immediately kill resistance, we ought to truly pay attention to it. But in terms of managing, one of the first things we want to do is we want to provide empathy and support. Can't say that word. Empathy refers to perspective taking, right? Can you put yourself in the shoes of the person who's being resistant? Understanding the situation as they view it in terms of the kind of fears and concerns and anxieties that that potential change might provide for them. And then providing support for that, right? Once you've been able to empathize with where people are sitting, being able to truly kind of, let them know that you understand how it is that they might feel that way. And then you might sort of think about some ways in which that kind of anxiety might be supported, or once again, things can be built into the system to account for that. And sometimes it really doesn't take very much accommodation to be able to deal with those anxieties. Communication. Right? Once again, oftentimes it's not that people are so resistant even to the particular program or the particular change. Oftentimes they're resistant because of a lack of trust. They don't feel like they're being given all the details. They don't feel as though the folks in charge of the change are forthcoming with information. And so in as much as you can be transparent, once again, about those pressures for change, that's going to actually help to deal with some of the resistance to change. The third one, and a very important one, is involving members in planning and decision making. In a minute, we're going to talk about how to develop political support, but you've got to get people involved, and not just in being lackeys who have to run with the ball, but you need to bring them to the table, and you need to get them involved in the planning. You want people to feel a sense of ownership over whatever the particular change process is. So definitely consistent with OD values, this ought not be a purely top-down driven process. It really ought to be a meeting in the middle, if you will. Okay? So let's talk about this next step, developing political support. Now notice I skipped creating vision because there's really nothing unique here other than the fact of specifying where that vision is. Presumably the organization has a vision statement. And so generally in a change management process, it's really a return to that vision statement, or perhaps it might even suggest a revising of that vision statement, but those processes are pretty much the same. I would say, other than making sure that obviously people are involved even in helping to craft that vision, there really is sort of no unique contribution from OD in that process. So I'm going to skip to the third one, which is developing political support. One of the things that we want to do is we want to be able to assess change agent power. There are a number of power models out there, so I'm not going to go into too much detail because you'll probably have to choose the power model that you think best fits the reality in which you're in. But you really want to kind of assess what kind of power the change agent. Now, when I mean change agent here, I'm not just talking about the consultant, even though the consultant really does need to know what power they have, but even those individuals who are heading the charge in the organization. And there's different kinds of power. So, for example, I'm not just referring about authority in the sense of what a formal manager might have, but even power in terms of influence, right? Some people don't have much formal power, but they're very influential. And so once again, you'd like to have some of those people on board. Some people have power in terms of knowledge. They are the go-to person when there's ignorance. And so once again, being able to assess that kind of power. Once again, you want people who have these various types of power to be a part of this group of folks who you allow to have input. You want to identify the key stakeholders. If you recall, stakeholders are anybody who are likely to be affected or have some effect on the change process. And so you want to identify those key folks, the people who can actually help to move it along, or even people who can put a stop to it. Once again, that's why you want to pay attention to people who are informal leaders in the organization, not just the formal leaders. And then once you've identified these folks, you want to influence them. You want, as a organizational consultant, you want to spend some time kind of talking with these folks. You want to sell them on it. Unless you get these folks really sold on the idea, you're not going to be able to overcome some of the hurdles. And you can see how this developing political support is a very big part of overcoming resistance to change, because these are the people who are likely going to be behind some of the ideologies or issues that are taking place that will halt what you do. Okay, so developing political support. Let's talk about actually managing the transition itself. Right, so at this point, we have motivated for change. We developed political support. Obviously, we have a vision in place, and now we're going to actually talk about how do we sort of make the transition. One of the things that's sort of talked about in your book is this sort of activity planning phase, and you can think of it as sort of the roadmap for change. So, for example, the idea of having an intervention strategy rather than just an intervention activity. Most interventions are really made up of multiple things that you do rather than sort of a one-time kind of thing. And so your intervention strategy might be something like the example here in the figure, in which we're going to do really 3 activities. We're going to have a new team startup workshop and do some strategic planning. Then we're going to have a goal and role clarity and team building. Right. Then we're going to do some process mapping and improving. And so, whereas the overall goal may have been activity 3, it's important that we recognize that we must in fact do activities 1 and 2 before we could even get to 3. So the intervention strategy includes all 3 activities, right? More so than just one particular activity, right? So this is that first step of activity planning. The next thing is that commitment planning. Whose support is needed? Where do these people stand, and how to influence their behavior? So once again, even though we've identified some of these key stakeholders, right, there are nonetheless people who are not within our immediate circle, or at least within our planning group, who nonetheless are going to be people who we're going to need. It may be people within the organization who are in other units. It may, in fact, even be people from outside of the organization, but it's important that we take the time to identify who these people are. And then change management structures. What's the appropriate arrangement of people and power to drive the change? And so we basically need, this is where we start really giving job assignments and role assignments. And once again, thinking about the kind of power that the various people who are part of our planning committee have might determine what roles we might want them to play as we go about doing the intervention. I think that's a very important thing to keep in mind, that even if the intervention is something like training, it's very important to get other people involved even in something like that. So this sort of key stakeholder group that you have, in as much as you can get these folks up in front of their colleagues, the better off it's going to be. And once again, that's consistent with the OD model of utilizing all resources. Okay. Let's talk about sustaining momentum. Then this is our last step in the model. There are a few things that we want to do once we've got our intervention off and running. We want to provide resources for the change. And once again, by resources, I'll remind you of my 3 T's: your time, talent, and treasure. Right? So you want to make sure that there's enough time being made available. You want to make sure that there is enough talent, right? That people with the right skills are available. And you want to make sure that the budget fits what you need. You want to build a support system for the change agents themselves. So these folks for whom you have delegated responsibilities for bringing about this, you want to make sure that there's something that's intentionally there for them, whether that support is more motivational or even in terms of ability. So even having training for change agents, things about how to influence colleagues and those kind of things. Conflict management, for example, might be a good thing for those folks who are out really trying to bring this thing about. Developing new competencies and skills. Any change is probably going to require a change in what people bring to the table. And so, I said before that training, though it is a different paradigm from OD, generally it tends to become a part of the OD toolkit, because ultimately you're going to have to develop new competencies and skills, and that's generally delivered through some form of training. Reinforcing new behaviors, and there are a number of ways in which you would do this. One of the main ways is taking a quick look at your performance management system to make sure that you are measuring and holding people accountable for engaging new behaviors, but also the way that you compensate people. Do you have a compensation system that recognizes and rewards people for making these new behaviors something they sort of focus on? And then staying the course. Having times in which you sort of come back and you literally reflect on the process itself. a very important thing. Sometimes it's good to even have people whose designated job is to do nothing other than that. They are process managers, and so their job is to constantly ask the question, are we on course? Are we moving along at a good enough pace? And they sort of blow the whistle if they sense that things have either strayed off of the main goal or they're not simply moving fast enough or in the right direction. Some foundational principles in structuring their interventions. Much of this information here actually is in your book for your reading, and so things like creating opportunities for learning. Remember that one of the main goals of OD is capacity building. We want to basically not just feed the organization for a day, but we want to teach the organization how to fish. And so we definitely want to make sure there are opportunities for the organization to learn how to deal with these kind of issues in the future. Giving free choice becomes very important. If the organization and the clients are going to have a sense of ownership, they must feel as though they've actually freely chosen what it is they're engaging in. Clear and explicit outcomes. Once again, that's a part of that, making sure that you have reasonable, positive expectations. Another thing is that everything matters. Everything from the room setup to the kind of agenda that you have. Everything that you do when you're doing an intervention matters. And so you want to give attention to the details. And sometimes we can underestimate the details. Something, as not dotting the I's and crossing T's, some people for whom that's an immediate turnoff. For example, one of the things I generally ask before I engage with a group is whether or not it's the culture of that organization to have a printed agenda. Some places swear by that, and so, if they don't walk in and you don't hand them a printed agenda, they don't feel like they've had a meeting. Other places, that's a cancer. And so that's something you want to check on, and you want to make sure that you're paying attention to the norms and the culture around, once again, the small things. Language can be very important. There are some organizations that certain words are dirty words, and so I ask about that. What are the buzzwords and what are the words to absolutely avoid in this organization? And then you want to consider the client and the consultant role. Once again, when you're talking about something even as subtle as training, there ought to be a role for both clients and consultants in everything that you do. Okay? So let's talk about some of the types of interventions. We're going to be, from this point on, kind of progressing through your book really in terms of these interventions. So in a minute, I'm going to turn and talk about the individual interventions, very briefly actually. But then we will, in the coming weeks, spend some time talking about team interventions and then really sort of whole organization interventions. So let's deal with individual interventions. One of the things that's important when you are thinking about interventions at the individual level is to really think about the cognitive and emotional state that people go through as they're going through a change. And so in your book, it kind of gives you sort of a three-stage kind of model in the sense of the first stage, generally anytime there's been a change, is sort of endings, right? People are having to sort of let go, past practices, beliefs, relationships. There's a range of emotions that they're likely to feel, everything from anxiety. If the change has been cast upon them without notice, they may in fact feel shock. One of the things that you have to make sure that you do is that you have to acknowledge the past. You have to, make sure you take some time to celebrate the successes. Before you just throw, their 50-year-old program in the trash, right? You might want to spend some time really kind of talking about and remembering, the ways in which that system, really brought about, help in when it was adopted. Everything that the organization has been doing worked at one point, and there's a reason why they chose that. And so you definitely don't want to just discard that, particularly because there might be people sitting in the room who had a big hand in developing or adopting whatever that past procedure was. Then you sort of get into sort of a neutral zone. And generally this is, the period while the change is underway or the change has just essentially been formalized in that case there. And people, once again, may be in a process of uncertainty. They're not quite sure what it is it's supposed to be doing. There may be some frustration because they don't know what they're supposed to be doing. Role ambiguity can be a big deal to deal with. And then eventually people come into new beginnings. At this stage has been sort of a redefinition of the self. Hopefully they can now see their new identity in whatever the new process is. They've had time to kind of make their psychological transition into the new procedure. So understanding this as a part of the psychology of individuals becomes important. And thinking through how you're going to move people through these, I think, becomes very important. And, let me emphasize that this is one of those things that is often, completely underestimated and taken for granted. That people will just sort of get with the program, get on the bandwagon, that kind of thing there, and without really giving sense. Sometimes we can try to rush people. We're upset that they're not acting in the quote-unquote new beginning stage, and yet we've just announced the change. And particularly, if you haven't taken the time to deal with those potential resistances to change that we talked about before. So there are a number of individual interventions. I won't necessarily try to give you the details. I think that your book defines them for you, so I'll just kind of briefly mention them here. But, essentially when we're talking about individual interventions, one of the main things that we tend to do at the individual level is we use a number of instruments and assessments. A lot of this is assessing the, what we might call affect, if you will, things like emotion or attitudes. Examples of something like this might be job satisfaction or organizational commitment or the degree to which they identify with the organization. All of these things can reflect a more affective kind of thing. You might be assessing their opinions towards something. You could assess their cognitive abilities. Many, for example, job selection tests tend to fit into this category. Their ability to make quantitative judgments in some sort or situational judgments of some sort might be this kind of thing. Or, in fact, you might be assessing their actual performance on some given task. And so, once again, these particular instruments and assessments tend to run from assessing the affective or the attitudinal, if you will, the cognitive, and the behavioral. Some of the more popular things that OD consultants tend to do would be things like coaching. Generally, in a coaching process, this is a one-on-one relationship between a coach and a coachee, if you will. And generally, the focus here is on developing a range of competencies or skills for the coachee. Coaching has become a very popular thing, and so definitely this is not an area in which OD consultants are unique in. You'll find lots of people coaching. Unfortunately, because it tends to be a popular area, you'll find a lot of people in this area who really don't really belong in this area, in the sense that they have no true understanding of human behavior in that case there, and so they're really just following a list of guidelines they probably downloaded off the internet. But a true coach is someone who definitely has an understanding of human behavior and understands how to bring about change at that human level. Something close to coaching but different is the idea of mentoring. Mentoring is different from coaching in the sense that coaching tends to be more of facilitating a process. And so I could be a coach of someone without truly knowing how to do their job, in the sense that I'm really just kind of helping them through that. So if you think about a professional basketball or football coach, they need not know themselves how to play the position, but they can in fact be someone who encourages, prods, plans, coordinates, if you will, others that know how to do their job. Mentoring is different. That in mentoring, it's generally more role modeling, and so in this case, a mentor typically does know how to do that job. if it's in fact job specific. Mentoring, though, can actually be more career related. And so it doesn't require that someone actually knows the job, because in this case, mentoring may be much more about how to get ahead in this organization. In that case, the person's expertise is that they're at a higher level in the organization. In that case there. Another individual intervention is 360-degree feedback. Don't know the degree which you're familiar with this. By 360 degrees, we mean that people generally get feedback at multiple levels in the organization. Generally, feedback from their immediate supervisors, feedback on a horizontal level from their peers, and then feedback from any people who in fact might report to them. So if you can imagine the circle around an individual, that's where the term 360 feedback gets. And of course what you're looking for there are consistencies. 50,000 Elvis fans can't be wrong. So if everybody in your organization says that you've got this particular problem or you've got this particular strength, you probably have that problem and you probably have that strength. Okay? And then finally, there's career planning and development. Generally, if we're talking about leadership development, or oftentimes if it's become kind of a component of downsizing an organization, that as a part of the compensation package, that people might be given some kind of career planning and development. There are a number of assessment tools that are out there. Perhaps one of the most popular is something called the Strong-Campbell Interest Inventory, and part of what it does is it kind of assesses what you're interested in, and then it matches your interest along with the interests of people who are already established in certain careers, with the idea that if your interests match the interests of people in established careers, that might in fact be a career for you. But definitely it can go beyond that to really sort of charting a path toward, if you one day want to be CEO of this company, here are a number of assignments that and things that you ought to do, or experiences that you ought to have in order to be able to become upwardly mobile in that case then. Okay? So these are not all the individual interventions that are out there, but these are the most popular ones that you're likely to hear about. Okay? So this ends my mini lecture then on interventions and then individual interventions. And so until next time, you take care.